Welcome to this public meeting of No to NATO, No to War. The No to NATO, No to War meetings are racking up enormous audiences. More than 1 million people watched the last broadcast, and more than 1 million will watch this one because the danger of war is mounting rapidly. I mean, real, non-local, non-regional, potentially intercontinental war. That's how serious the situation is. The war in Gaza, where genocidal, frenzied assaults on a captive population have been running now for almost 3 months, has already spread beyond the borders of Palestine. The murder of a Hamas official in Beirut, the murder of an Iranian general in Damascus, the murders in Iraq, where the Iraqi Ministry of the Interior was attacked, was bombed by the United States military, shows how fast, how completely this potential disaster for the world is spreading. So I'd like to begin by wishing you a happy new year, but that would be frankly absurd because it isn't happy for a very large number of people already, and it risks turning catastrophically unhappy for the rest of us. We were going to focus this public meeting on the Red Sea, hence the title, and we will, of course, because war is already spread to the Red Sea. The British and American navies, the Navy of the Seychelles, if they have one other than on paper, the Navy of Bahrain. Why would they need a navy? The American and British fleet function as their navy and are permanently docked in their harbor. The Navy of the Netherlands was rumored to be a part of Joe Biden's armada sent to sail against the people of Yemen, though we've yet to see their colors on the mast. The proximate cause for war on Yemen is what? That Yemen are applying economic sanctions against the Zionist state to try to force it to cease fire, to try to force it to allow water in to the Palestinians in Gaza who are dying of thirst, to allow food in to Gaza, where the World Food Programme, the arm of the United Nations, says the overwhelming number of starving people in the world are currently trapped in Gaza. The people of Yemen are trying to allow some repair to the hospitals in Gaza so that they can treat the wounded and try to save the dying and the dead. Try to save them from being placed in that cold earth in the Gaza Strip. The people of Yemen are only trying to get the sewage system repaired in Gaza, which is the cause of now rampant disease, which even the Israeli invaders are now catching and taking home to their own families, their own people, in their own home cities and towns. That's all the Yemen people are doing. They don't have the means to force Israel off the SWIFT system or any of the other plethora of sanctions which Western countries habitually place on almost everybody in the world. The only sanction that the people of Yemen are able to employ is their proximity to and their potential control over the Red Sea. And all they're saying is don't sail to or from Israel. Don't supply Israel through our waters. Everyone else can sail untrammeled. No one will be hindered in any way as long as they are not parked of supplying the Israeli war machine. We should be throwing flowers at the people of Yemen, not throwing bombs at them and threatening to invade them. For that is exactly what the UK and US governments are openly threatening to do. Somebody called Grant Shapps. It's a measure of Britain's reduced circumstances in the world. That little Grant Shapps, who has a multiple number of aliases still trailing from his business career, could end up as Britain's war minister. But he briefed the newspapers just a few days ago saying that Britain was going to invade Yemen. Well, at least we have the maps, because we used to invade Yemen very regularly indeed, until the Yemenis kicked our ass out of their country, and we haven't dared actually physically to go back since. One of my earliest memories in politics is watching the brave people of the Crater district of Aden, the port in South Yemen, watching them driving out, fighting tooth and nail against the British armed forces who occupied them there. I was 13 years old at the time. It's made a big impression on me. I very much hope, for the sake of my fellow countrymen, that that doesn't have to happen again, but that is now being openly threatened. That means that the Red Sea is yet another NATO theater of operations. My goodness, this North Atlantic Treaty Organization gets around, doesn't it? It's in the South China Sea. It has made Colombia an associate member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That is until the Colombian people had the good sense to elect a progressive government, at which point the NATO associate membership seems to have disappeared somewhere into the ether. The British Navy is currently off what used to be called British Guyana. These imperial fantasies have no end, it appears. Why? Because they want to threaten the government of Venezuela over the theft of Venezuelan oil resources. So NATO is off British Guyana. NATO was in Colombia. NATO is in the South China Sea, and NATO is now in the Red Sea. But that's not the only NATO involvement in West Asia, in the Middle East at this point in time, is it? Because the vice president of NATO, the number 2 in the organization, welcomed publicly the illegal assassination, the murder carried out by Israel in Beirut just a few days ago. So that's another NATO operation. NATO weapons and transportation systems, deeply involving the United Kingdom through its base in Cyprus, which allows it to make war without even telling the government of Cyprus. How's that for independence? The NATO countries are deeply involved now in all of these conflicts, all of this killing, all of this bloodletting, and therefore all of the dangers that are currently facing us imminently. And none of those is more important than the situation in Iran. The terrorist atrocity that took place at the anniversary commemoration of the martyr General Hajj Soleimani was one of the most horrific acts of mass murder in recent times. A very large crowd of people with 2 explosions wrought amongst them, killing and maiming, wounding hundreds of people. I smelt a rat as soon as I saw the news of the mass murder in Kerman. I believed, and I still believe, that the United States and Israel are involved in that crime, either directly or indirectly. Either directly or indirectly, like indirectly, some of their proxies have been put up to this act of foul terrorist murder. And when I heard the United States yesterday blaming ISIS, I felt sure that ISIS would then, in perfect synchronicity, step forward and claim responsibility for this mass murder. And they duly did this very day. Now, maybe they did carry it out, maybe they didn't. But for that to be a free pass for the United States in Israel would require the United States and Israel to have nothing to do with ISIS. But of course, as we well know, they have a lot to do with ISIS. Maybe they have everything to do with ISIS. They are the allies of ISIS in Syria. They killed Soleimani, who was the hammer of ISIS, which, objectively speaking, was a relief for ISIS. They backed ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the alphabet soup of Takfiri fanatic extremism in Syria for a whole decade. They gave them air cover, they gave them weapons, they gave them money, they gave them propaganda and other diplomatic support. Not since Britain and the United States supported Pol Pot in the United Nations as the legitimate holder of the Cambodian seat in the UN, have these Western countries been so deeply involved with an organization so foul, so evil? Its acts sometimes are difficult to believe. So whoever carried out this atrocity in Kerman in Iran and killed all those innocent civilian Iranian people, it's very unlikely that the United States and Israel had no connection to these murderers whatsoever. And so the point I'm trying to make is that the danger of regional, the danger of international war is growing exponentially. I don't know how many hundreds have been murdered in Gaza today, but I know there was 300 murdered yesterday. I know that most of them were children, and when they weren't children, they were the mothers of those children. I know that it's overwhelmingly likely that the Israelis were not murdering the Hamas and other resistance organization fighters because they are signally failing to do that. As a matter of fact, the resistance on the ground in the Gaza Strip, fighting man to man, is defeating the Israeli invaders there. That's what's causing second, third, fourth, fifth thoughts on the part of many in the military hierarchy in the Israeli armed forces. That's what's causing the walk back performed by Kirby, the White House spokesman, yesterday, when he conceded openly, Hamas will not be defeated. It can be degraded, he said, but it will not be defeated. Its military posture, he said, remains strong. You bet it remains strong. Ask the Israeli invaders just how strong their military posture continues to be. The Israelis are good at murdering women and children. They're good at making TikTok videos while sitting in the beds of children. They're good at making humiliating TikTok videos that they think are humiliating the Palestinians they've invaded, but in fact are humiliating only to themselves. They're good at murdering people from on high against a people with no anti-aircraft capacity whatsoever, with no air force, no ability to stop them from massacring people. They're good at that. But when it comes to an actual physical invasion of the territory, the space of the Palestinian people, they have proved a humiliating failure. But that too contains dangers within, because for all their failure inside the Gaza Strip, then some minds are turning to what I might call the Samson option. Well, let's bring the roof down on everybody. If people in the West are beginning to turn against us, maybe we should bring the roof down on top of everybody. Maybe we should make this a really big war against all kinds of countries and enemies, and force those who claim to be our allies to enter the contest with us. These are my opening thoughts. I'm joined by, we've always got an excellent panel, but I'm joined by an unusually distinguished panel this evening for this No to NATO, No to War rally. And the first of those speakers is Professor Seyed Mohammad Marandi, the Professor of American Studies at the University of Tehran. And I now invite him to take the floor. Professor, first of all, our condolences to you and to the Iranian people for the mass murder that occurred in your country yesterday. I wonder if you might enlighten us at the beginning of your contribution what the latest state of affairs is in that great crime.
Thank you, George. It was a really painful day yesterday, and I was telling friends that imagine what it's like for the people of Gaza, where every few hours you have a massacre, and where every few hours people are terrorized, but in between you hear the drones flying above and you hear artillery shells from far off. It's a 24-hour a day misery that these people have to live through, and it seems to be never ending. Yesterday, I think 80 some people were murdered in the terror attacks. Last night, they said there were over 100, but apparently some of the names were given twice. But there were 2 bomb explosions. The intelligence services are trying to figure out who was behind the bomb and the bombings. And as you point out, as you said, the chances that the Israelis or the Americans, but in particular the Israelis, were behind this is quite high. Even if ISIS were to claim responsibility, the timing is very strange, coming right after the terror attack in Beirut, and before that, the terror attack in Damascus, where an Iranian general was murdered. Some people say that the Israelis don't kill innocent people and they carry out targeted strikes. Apparently, they haven't been watching the news of Gaza for the past 3 months. But also, I would add that, and your other guest, Mr. Ford, would know this better than I, that ISIS and Israel do have a long-standing relationship. During the dirty war in Syria, we know that Al-Qaeda was on the side of the Americans. Why? Because the current US National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, in an email, I think on February the 12th, 2012, this is all online, to Hillary Clinton, who was then the Secretary of State, wrote that in Syria, ISIS is Al-Qaeda is on our side. And back then, Al-Qaeda and ISIS were one. Also in that year, we have a statement, we have a text, a document from the National Defense Agency of the United States, Defense Intelligence Agency of the United States, which said that US regional allies, meaning Turkey and the Saudis and others, Qatar and other countries, they were trying to create a Salafist entity between Syria and Iraq. Well, that entity turned out to be ISIS. And then Michael Flynn, General Michael Flynn, who was the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency at that time, in an interview on Al Jazeera, of all places, said that the United States took a willful decision, the Obama regime took a willful decision to support this policy. So ISIS had the support of the West, and also alongside the Golan Heights, which is occupied Syrian territory, ISIS had entrenched themselves. And alongside another part of the Golan Heights, Al-Qaeda entrenched themselves. And the Israelis supported both of them. They treated their wounded. When the Syrian Arab army would attack them, the Israelis would bomb them, the Syrians. They would bomb, they would use their helicopters and airplanes to bomb them. They'd use artillery, and they'd use their tanks and mortars to shell the Syrian army to prevent them from taking these positions from ISIS or Al-Qaeda. So the link between the Israeli regime and ISIS is very well established. Of course, ISIS was closely linked to NATO. ISIS was selling oil, as I think we all remember, to Turkey. And there were huge convoys going day and night, sending that oil, until the Russians came in and got involved and started bombing those convoys. So the relationship between Israel, NATO, and ISIS is well established. So the possibility that the Israeli regime carried out this atrocity is very high. And there's also a motive, because Netanyahu and people like Netanyahu wants the war to continue personally, because if the war stops, if there's a ceasefire, he could lose his job and then go to jail for corruption charges. But also Netanyahu and others, they're losing the war. The Israeli regime has lost in Gaza. It is a strategic defeat, especially since the other resistance factions are supporting Gaza. Hezbollah is keeping half of the Israeli army busy in the north, and the Yemeni armed forces, Ansarullah, what the West often calls the Houthis, the Yemeni armed forces, their navy is preventing ships from, as you pointed out, traveling to or going to Israeli ports. So a lot of pressure is being put on the Israeli regime. And of course, Iran is supporting Hamas. Iran is supporting Islamic Jihad. Iran is supporting all of these resistance organizations. That's exactly how Hamas and its allies were able to create these fantastic defense capabilities under the ground. So they've lost the war, and now they need, Netanyahu in particular, but the Israeli regime needs to bring in the Americans. And that's why they are provoking Lebanon. They're provoking Hezbollah. They're provoking Iran through assassinations and potentially this atrocity in Kerman yesterday. The Israelis want the Americans to come in to create a regional war. And that also, I think, shows what we've been saying for many years, that Israel is detrimental to Western interests. The West is paying a huge price for what Israel is doing, not only because this genocide is not seen by the world as just an Israeli genocide, but it's seen as a Western genocide. But the West is paying all sorts of costs because of this war, and the expansion of the conflict will make things worse for the West. But also, it shows that the Israeli regime is willing to sacrifice the West for itself. It wants the West to come into fight, to potentially face a global economic meltdown, because the Red Sea is very sensitive, the Persian Gulf is even more sensitive, but they're willing to do that. They're willing to create death and destruction for their Western allies, for the sake of their own preservation.
They're, in fact, increasingly showing their contempt for their own allies. Two of Netanyahu's ministers, in terms, told the US government and anyone else who might be interested in urging heavily, in quotes, restraint upon them, that we are not a star on the American flag, that we don't take orders, even from the people who feed us and arm us and fund us and proselytize for us and defend us in the United Nations and so on. This is a client state that is somewhat out of control, Professor.
Yes, and they tell the Americans that we're not an American state, but they're receiving American assistance day and night. Weapons are being sent to Israel to carry out the genocide 24 hours a day. Planes are constantly landing in Israel full of bombs and supplies and weapons and spare parts for the Zionist armed forces. And it is out of control, but I think the Israeli regime in the West recognizes that this is not a winnable war. Imagine how powerful Yemen must be. When the Israeli regime fails to take the small Gaza Strip from Hamas and allies because of the tunnels and because of the defense capabilities that have been created underground, well, then imagine what sort of defense capabilities Yemen has underground. Yemen, which has not been surrounded over the last 2 years like Gaza has been. Imagine what defense capabilities exist in Lebanon. And imagine the vulnerability of the Americans in Iraq and Syria. And the resistance in Iraq keeps reminding the Americans about their vulnerability by constantly targeting their illegal air bases in Syria and Iraq. So the West is very vulnerable. And here I'd like to go and repeat what you were saying about Yemen. The people of Yemen are truly heroic. For 7 years, they faced similar conditions as the people of Gaza. They were starved. And the Americans and NATO helped starve them. They imposed a starvation siege with their navies. The Saudis and the Emiratis carried out genocide day and night. And thousands of British advisors were helping keep the Saudi and Emirati Air Force functioning. Weapons were coming in from Canada, from the United States. Ammunition was coming in from the Americans day and night. And the Germans and the French, the British, everyone was a part of this genocide. And the Saudis and the Emiratis spent hundreds of billions of dollars to carry out this genocide. They could have had friendship with Yemen by investing a couple of $1 billion. But instead, they chose to waste hundreds of billions of dollars to kill these people with the help of NATO. And the Arabic media, because it's owned by states that are close to the United States, was almost universally hostile towards Yemen, except for Al Mayadeen and Al Manar and a few others. So many people in the Arab world, even as the people of Yemen were dying, they were unsympathetic. But when Gaza became the target of an Israeli genocide. The only capital to openly come out and declare that they will fight against this genocide was Sana'a, the capital of Yemen. The Yemeni government stood up and said that they will not allow ships to go to Israeli ports until the genocide stops, as you pointed out. And now the people of Yemen are celebrated across the Arab world. Those very same governments that were demonizing them, now they are being demonized by their own they're being attacked by their own population. They're despised by their own population. And their populations are looking to Yemen as heroes. So, but in any case, the fact is that the world has changed. The Israeli regime cannot win this war. It has lost. And if the Americans want to enter the fray, if they want to become a part of the war, it will have to face an unbearable price. It will pay an unbearable price. And especially at a time when the United States is losing a war in Ukraine and it's confronting the Chinese across the board. This is not a winnable war for the Americans. They will lose, but the Israelis are willing to sacrifice the Americans and the Europeans to save face.
Especially in an election year. Thank you very much, Professor. We'll hear from you again. But first, I want to bring in our other speaker this evening, a comrade of mine, the deputy leader of the Workers' Party of Britain, which I lead. But most interestingly, a former British ambassador to, amongst other places, the Syrian Arab Republic. So please welcome the Honourable Peter Ford, former British ambassador. Peter, what do you think about what the professor was saying? What do you think about the scene that is rolled out in front of us now? It's hard to keep track. It's like whack-a-mole. Where's the next fire going to break out? Over to you.
Yes, thank you, George, for that introduction. I'm flattered. I would agree with virtually all of the professor's analysis, but just a few nuances of more questions than differences. I agree that the Israelis have already lost on the strategic level in Gaza. And much of what's happening now is just the creation of a cover story for an Israeli climb down. So unable as they are to use their awful word, decapitate Hamas in Gaza, they turn to an easy, soft target in an apartment block in downtown Beirut. This is displacement activity for not being able to carry out the killings of the Hamas leadership in Gaza. It's meant to give a sop to an Israeli public which can't get enough of Palestinian blood, which has an unquenchable thirst for Palestinian blood. But it's not important on the strategic level. Clearly, it's not going to impact Hamas's military capabilities, but it is going to give Netanyahu something to point to. I mean, the poor guy has absolutely nothing to point to after more than 10 weeks of intense military activity. No hostages, apart from those whose release was negotiated on a mutual basis. No Hamas heads on a plate. Inability to degrade to any significant degree Hamas's defensive capabilities, as illustrated on a daily basis by the continuing rocket fire from Gaza. he's got nothing to point to. So they turn to assassination. It gives them in their warped way some form of compensation. But we must be grateful for small mercies. If this is the way they climb down off the branch along which they've climbed too far, well, it's a small price to pay. Do they want to bring in the Americans? Well, on this, I'm less convinced. The strike in Beirut was, again, I use a word I hate, surgical, in the sense that it didn't kill any Lebanese. This is important for Hezbollah because Hezbollah would have reacted much more firmly had there been Lebanese victims. The poor victims were all Palestinians, apparently. If Israel had wanted to goad Hezbollah and Iran into reacting foolishly, I think they would have gone about it a different way. And it's the same with the other murders and atrocities. If Israel was seriously trying to goad Iran, and they know that Iran is almost unprovocable. Iran's past history shows that they, more than anyone, understand that revenge is a dish best consumed cold. How did Iran react to the killing of Soleimani? One cannot point to a single act, but Iran, they got their revenge by doing what Iran does, by continuing on the courses of action which so upset the Americans, defeating sanctions against themselves, supporting Iran, supporting Hamas, and all the rest of the activities that Iran carries out to support the axis of resistance. But they did not carry out an act of retaliation, nor do I think they will be foolish enough to let themselves be provoked now. As for the dreadful atrocity in Iran itself, well, as far as I'm concerned, the jury is still out. I would not deny all agency to ISIS. ISIS, or the rump of ISIS, which is left, would still have motive to try to drag America into an attack on its arch foe, Iran, as well as Israel. There's a congruence of interests and motives there. I mean, maybe, as you suggested, ISIS have been manipulated into this, but they would want to do it anyway, I think. But at the end of the day, the important thing is that it takes two to tango. And I think Iran and its allies are far too savvy to fall into any traps, however provocative. And I really don't think they will overreact. But I'd like to go back to the Red Sea issue for a moment and recall that it was another country which started off this round of piracy. Actually, in July 2019, 30 British Marines boarded an Iranian tanker off Gibraltar, allegedly to prevent a breach of sanctions. This was a pure act of piracy, and it was rewarded, as I could have warned them, and maybe some foreign office diplomats did warn them, that Iran would react in its own way, and Iran reacted by sequestering 2 British ships in the Gulf, and the British had to climb down pretty smartish. So, but Iran played the game very cleverly. They faced down a threat, but without overreacting. Their response was very measured and equivalent to the affront, and they got their way. Similarly, one could argue, I would argue, that they got their revenge for the killing of Soleimani some months ago in the form of their agreement with Saudi Arabia under the auspices of China. This was a very, very strategically important development, effectively taking Saudi Arabia out of the US imperium. And from that day, Saudi has continued to behave like Indians off the reservation. They've refused to be corralled into this US armada. And every day that passes brings more evidence that the Saudis have learned the lesson that the best way of ensuring your security is not to make enemies and not let America or Britain drag you into conflicts unnecessarily. I think they've absorbed that lesson, and it's down partly to skillful Iranian diplomacy and military diplomacy.
Excellency, what do you make of, you and I are both old enough to remember when Britain was strung out on the rocks of Aden. We know of British history there in the Yemen. What do you make of this jumped up little defense secretary of ours, Grant Shapps, if that's the name he's currently going under, openly briefing the British media that Britain was actually going to go to war with Yemen? I'm not sure with whose army. I'm not sure with whose navy. I used to be the member of parliament for a warship building yard in my constituency in Glasgow on the Clyde. And I've watched the British Navy almost dwindle away. I don't know how we can spare the ship to go to British Guyana, as it was once called, because our Navy is stuck together with glue. Is it a credible threat that the incredible Mr. Shapps is making against Yemen?
Well, he's a strutting martinet, isn't he? He's like many non-military people who, once they get near the military, just can't wait for the day that they can don a flak jacket. This has yet to come for Shapps. It came the other day for our friend Starmer. They can't resist it, posing as a military macho figure, but it's absurd. And in the case of Shapps, he had a long history of being one of the biggest friends of Israel in the British Parliament. And if he's not a Mossad asset, I'm not saying he's a Mossad asset, but if he was, he wouldn't be behaving any differently. Because it's as though the British action would not be entirely in defense of Israel. I won't call them the Houthis, I think they prefer to be called Ansar Allah. The Yemeni Ansar Allah are targeting vessels associated with Israel, and I think they've been pretty accurate in their targeting in that respect. And therefore, the way to keep British shipping and British interests safe is not to use Israeli-associated vessels and not to go to the rescue of Israel and involve Britain unnecessarily in this conflict. That would be the rational defense policy response, to stay well away and to make clear that you are not defending Israel. Instead, Shapps and the government have done the opposite. It's total foolishness.
Gilbert and Sullivan springs to mind. Thank you Ambassador will give you the last word. But before that, summing up of the discussion from the most excellent Professor Marandi. Professor, any final thoughts you would gift us?
I'd just like to salute all those people who've been standing up against this genocide, what many people here are calling a Holocaust. Jewish Americans standing up against the Israeli regime, the Western media, and the political establishment, Christians, Muslims, and everyone else who've been doing their best to stop this atrocity, these atrocities that are taking place 24 hours a day, even as we sleep. And also, I'd like to salute the people of Yemen for struggling to save the people of Gaza. Hezbollah, which has given well over 100 martyrs to draw the Israeli army away from Gaza. Just yesterday, they gave 8 martyrs, and martyrs in Iraq that constantly harass the illegal occupation forces in Syria and Iraq to make sure that the Americans think twice before they enter any conflict on behalf of the Israeli regime. And of course, the Iranian martyrs, especially General Soleimani, who helped create the defense capabilities in Gaza, who probably was the key to the creation of these defense capabilities that have held the Israeli regime at bay. But at the top, I would like to really remind everyone about the heroic people of Gaza. And I don't mean just Hamas or Islamic Jihad or the others, but I mean the women and children, first and foremost, and other civilians who are steadfast, who didn't flee, who stood their ground, and who are suffering the consequences, but who are unwilling to accept another Nakba.
Amen. Thank you, Professor Marandi. Ambassador Peter Ford, the last words are yours. It is something incredible to me. I put it this way: I've been in politics a very long time, more than 50 years in the politics of Palestine, never mind politics in general. But if you'd said to me 12 weeks ago that 30,000 Palestinians would be massacred, most of them women and children, would be starved, that the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, war, famine, pestilence, disease, would be running rampant in a tiny, tiny place from which there is no escape, and that the West and that the political class and that the mass media would show no sign whatsoever of a comprehensive retreat from their shoulder-to-shoulder stance with Netanyahu, I wouldn't actually have believed it. It's taken my breath away somewhat. What about you?
Yes, it is so sobering to think that there has really been so little reaction, and yet at the popular level there has been an enormous set of reactions around the world. Anyone who's participated in the huge protest in London will have felt this. Well over 100,000 people, maybe 200,000-300,000 people walking, marching together, despite the media campaign to portray these as hate marches. And one notes the preponderance of younger people. There's a generational difference here. Younger people, many of whom care about the planet, also care about Gaza. This is their Vietnam. The comparison is not exaggerated or overdrawn, I think. This is their Vietnam, and this will have long-term repercussions, not only for policy vis-a-vis Israel, but foreign policy generally, I believe.
Ambassador Peter Ford, Professor Seyed Mohammad Marandi, thank you for joining us on this No to NATO, No to War broadcast. And thanks to the audience that will watch this this evening and will spread it, as has been happening with all of our public meetings since the organization was launched by the Workers' Party of Britain more than a year ago now. The audience has grown exponentially beyond our wildest anticipation. But that's not just because of the excellent work and the excellent speakers that we have been putting forward, the spirit, ecumenical spirit, politically speaking, with which we approach our work. There's no blood test here. We invite speakers of all different political, ideological, and other stripes. It's not just because of that. It's because the world has become so turbulent, so unstable, as it passes through this transition, this difficult labor, as it moves from a unipolar to a multipolar state of affairs. It's choppy waters, it's turbulent, it's painful, it's bloody, but there isn't any doubt at all that a better new world is soon to be born. Hang on in there, everyone who's resisting the war machine. And thank you for watching us. Follow our organization on all platforms and come back for the next meeting, probably in a couple of weeks' time. Thank you.